What is going on, ladies and gentlemen? It is Steiner with a very special episode for Days Between of Secondhand Talent. With us, we have publicist and historian of the Grateful Dead, Dennis McNally, as well as author of The Last Great Dream, How Bohemians Became Hippies and Created the Sixties, as well as author of A Long Straight Trip, The Inside History of the Grateful Dead, and Desolate Angel. Ladies and gentlemen, the one, the only, Dennis McNally. Welcome to the show, sir.
Thank God there's only one.
Actually,
that's not true. That I had a very charming encounter where I met somebody. I forget how it worked, but I met someone came up to me and said, "My father's name Dennis McNally," and I went, "Oh," and he was a lawyer, a little older than I am, not a lot, and I said, "Well, tell him to come to the show." So he was a lawyer in Milwaukee, and we were at some Chicago show, and I had him. He came, this is he was not by then he was in his 50s or 60s, whatever, and became a deadhead, or at least a bit of a deadhead, so, but and there's also, by the way, a historian, a Jesuit priest who's a historian of church sacred spaces. I think he's in New York. I think maybe at Fordham, but and I once wrote him a note and said, by the way, just out of curiosity, how many times have you been asked for tickets? And he said, "Oh, whenever the Dead come to New York, I get a couple requests that I have to explain." So there you go. I got to admit, nobody's asked me for the keys to a sacred space other than the stage of the Grateful Dead.
Yeah, I mean, there aren't many spaces more sacred than that. I did have the good fortune of seeing a concert one time. Oh, it's another story for another time. We're here to talk about you. This book was very, very interesting to me. I thought it was really a big jump from your previous book to a very a very wide spanning topic. I mean, the Grateful Dead, of course, can be written about ad nauseum, but there isn't really very much literature about the very specific parts of the era that you choose to write about in The Last Great Dream. What was it about this era that really drove you to want to explore it in this detail?
You're right that it's considerably more expansive than my first two books. So I was in graduate school and I was looking for a topic, and long story short, I just started working on Jack Kerouac, and that ended up becoming a book called Desolate Angel. And the guy who gave me a shove in that direction was also a deadhead, turned me into a deadhead. And so by the time I was done with the Kerouac book, I wanted to write the second book. I saw all the connections between the Beats and the Grateful Dead. Most obviously Neil Cassidy, who was Dean Moriarty and On the Road, and certainly an essential part of the Beat scene. And then, of course, Cowboy Neil at the wheel of the bus to Never Everland for the Grateful Dead. So long, very long story short, because I became the publicist and could not do both at the same time. So that both work on the book and be a publicist. So it took 20 years to eventually write the Grateful Dead book, put that out in 2002. Ended up going back and writing a book called On Highway 61, which was the deep background of why some Americans don't buy into the mainstream culture, why they become why they diverge from the common path, starting actually with Thoreau and going all the way to Dylan. And then I sort of paused, and finally what happened was that in 2016 which was to say a year before the 50th anniversary of the Summer of Love in San Francisco. Um, I had lunch with a wonderful woman named Anthea Hardig, who's now at the Smithsonian, and she was running the California Historical Society, and she said, "We're preparing to do a big show to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Summer of Love." Um, every museum and whatnot in the Bay Area, it was a big deal, especially here. Um, and how would you like to curate a photo show? Which I'd never done, and which turned into a treasure hunt. It was great fun. And so I started because I knew the story I wanted. I quickly understood what story I was going to tell, which was, of course, what led up to the Summer of Love, which, in fact, by the way, was not the summer of 1967, but the true Summer of Love was the fall of 1966, before they were having such a good time that they threw a party to celebrate, and it was called the Be-In January of 67, and somewhere between 30 and 50,000 people showed up. They blew their own cover. The media descended, and it was never quite the same after. But at any rate, so I started working on this photo show, and I don't know, a couple of months into it, I suddenly went, "Hey, Bozo, this is a book." And had a wonderful time. And the Grateful Dead has a beginning and an end, obviously, or Kerouac, when he died, to some extent when Jerry died. That's basically where I end the Grateful Dead book. But this was a more wide open topic that was not so specific. And I was sort of free to begin where I wanted to begin, which turned out to be with the poets, the anarchist poets of San Francisco in the 1940s. And of course, it went in the end, the place I chose to end it was the Monterey Pop Festival, which was sort of the high water mark of, people think of the Summer of Love, that era, the whole hippie thing, as beautiful young people with flowers in their hair, really, really high, listening to wonderful music, being incredibly peaceful and having a lot of fun. And in particular, for 4 days at the Monterey Pop Festival, that was reality. It really worked that way. One of the first things you have to know about this, that is, they had room for 7,000 people in the arena at the festival, and there were at least 30,000 people on the grounds, and nothing bad happened, which, when you think about all the possibilities and what has happened at various festivals since, it says a lot. So
Yep.
that was the story, and I started with the poets and went through a bunch of artists that were affected by that. A wide range. There's sort of two books. There's the part that hardly anybody knows about, which is the art scene, the radical. I don't know if radical implies politics, and it had some politics, but the divergent avant-garde art scene in San Francisco, in particular, although also in New York and Los Angeles and London, in the 50s, leading up to what is much more familiar with people, which is the immediate events of the so-called the hippie scene, the Summer of Love in San Francisco.
Sure. No, absolutely. And I will say it is, to this date, the most thorough account I've ever read of those years. There's a lot of names that I had heard, but not a lot that I had known about them.
No,
So
there's a lot of names. That's what people kept saying when I first started getting readers, and they all said, "Oh, there's so many." So I put a glossary just to help people make reference to names if they were mentioned a second time where it wasn't obvious.
I
Um,
was
but
curious actually if the glossary was meant as a self-referential Wikipedia of
Oh,
sorts.
well, yeah.
It's
Although
very
I
useful. I
also
love
told
it.
people,
It's
when I was
love it
first,
as an
you have a
addendum.
computer in your hand, look it up. Um,
Mm.
and but yeah, it should be more or less self-contained, and to the best of my ability, it was. Uh, but yeah, the idea was simply to see who came to the hate, because see, my one gripe, uh, and kind of surprised when I started researching, is that nobody had done this book before. All the books about the summer of love
Mm.
virtually start in 1965,
Hmm.
usually in the Red Dog Saloon, which is it's a place in a ghost town, tourist town, up in the mountains above San Francisco, um, where the charlatans combined LSD and a light show, very primitive, but a light show, and rock and roll, primitive, but rock and roll, um, into, a scene. Um, but of course, where did they come from? And that's where I found the story the most interesting.
And it really is expansive, and I do find that appendix helpful, and I wish more more authors did such when writing such histories. I think I want to go back to real quick. You mentioned Bob Dylan and Thoreau both in your earlier statement, and I think that the echo of both of their sentiments, both of who you mentioned in the introduction to the book as well. Um, Folks, you can find a link to buy that in the description of this episode. But you mentioned both of them in the introduction of this book. I am a big fan of both Dylan and Thoreau as well. I love. I when I was an English teacher, I made it a point to include Thoreau in every school year at least once, to include some of his work, because I think one of the most fascinating things that I've observed just as in my career as an educator was that, the attention span of my generation compared to the attention span of my students for total silence, absolute silence, has decreased from, I believe, 9 seconds to approximately 3.5 to 4 seconds. That's terrifying to me, especially, having read as much of Thoreau's work that I have, and knowing as much about him as I do. But there are so many other folks included in this glossary, and I'm curious if there are any other earlier names that you felt were important to write about. As you mentioned, this is an area of history that really, truly is largely unwritten about. And I'm curious if there's any specific people that gave you an impetus to write these histories out.
There are, literally all kinds of people. Just to mention a couple, there was a very interesting poet who did not publish a lot, um, but affected the people around him greatly, by the name of Wallace Berman. He was from L.A. He started a magazine called Semina, which consisted of an envelope filled with objects. He never sold it. I think it was sold once briefly, one issue. I think they did 10 issues over the years. And he would put in a poem or a photograph or just stuff. I think, and it was, it, he was at the nexus of poetry, and this is starting in the late 50s, the sort of the where painting and avant-garde painting, which was very had quite a lot of flowering in LA, which is where he was mostly, um, with poetry, which was a little stronger in San Francisco. There were some poets in LA, but they were they were not as strong as elsewhere. Anyway, Burma was, really important, that people just don't know about. Another is a guy that people don't know about at all. He's not famous at all outside of the Zen community in the Bay Area. And that's a guy named Mel Weitzman, who really, in some ways, connects so much of this. So after I talk about the book starts with Kenneth Rexroth and Robert Duncan, who were well-known poets in San Francisco. And one of them was but they were both kind of anarchistic, but one was in particular a consciously an anarchist, philosophical anarchist, not a bomb thrower, and the other was a kind of a mystic involved with, had been raised in Rosicrucian and just mysticism in general, and then they started, they started having an influence, in particular on the students at the San Francisco Art Institute. One of those students, two of them, one was a guy named Wally Hedrick, and the other guy was named Mel Weitzman. Wally became a pretty well-known artist in an assemblage. He worked in steel. It wasn't just paint. Wally also taught at the Art Institute weekend classes to high school kids. One of his students was a kid named Jerry Garcia. Jerry, who was this sort of born skeptic and kind of streetwise punk, and interested in painting, went to these classes, and among other things, Wally played acoustic guitar music, blues, like Big Bill Brunzi, while they painted, which ended up getting this kid Garcia interested in the guitar, which kind of settled his life for the rest of his life. And the other thing is that he and his buddy asked Wally about the Beats. Now, this is like 1958. Jerry's 16 years old. He's a high school kid, and they asked about the Beats, and Wally says, "You guys are beat. Go down to City Lights bookstore and get this book on the road," which Jerry did. And it became his Bible. That's how he came to invite me to be the Grateful Dead's biographer, because he liked what I did with Kerouac. Or as he put it, it agreed with his prejudices. Jerry was wry, shall we say, WRY. Anyway, the other guy, also a student at the Art Institute, very heavily influenced by that, who also, among other things, played trumpet, was this beatnik in North Beach, which was the beatnik neighborhood of San Francisco, Mel Weitzman. And he, as I say, he played trumpet at night, drove a cab during the day. And then what happened was that in 1964, he'd always been spiritually wandering. He met a man named Shunryo Suzuki, who was the founder of the San Francisco Zen Center, really one of the important figures introducing Zen and Buddhism to America. And that became Mel's path. And he eventually became the abbot both of San Francisco Zen Center after Suzuki died, and later the Berkeley Zen Center. So you've never heard of him unless you're, as I say, a Zenny in the Bay Area. But he's the perfect example of what happened to people who were exposed to divergent ideas in San Francisco in the 50s.
You mentioned a lot in the book. The Beats and the Diggers, right? You have these kind of these two spectrums, and I'm curious, how do you place the Beats and the West Coast poetry renaissance in the total counterculture genealogy as it was? And I was just going to follow that up with just curiosity if there's any beat ideas that you think traveled into the hate, or maybe some that didn't.
Everything about the Beats, which was basically, anti-materialism, anti-war, anti-corporatism, anti-racism, all of that is taken whole into the 60s. What happened with the Beats was that if you take all those ideas, many ideas, the bulk of the ideas. And then you add LSD, and you get into a more communal and colorful scene in the hate. Um, there you are. And the obvious example of all that is the Be-In, in which before the Grateful Dead and Quicksilver played, the Beat Poets, Allen Ginsberg, Michael McClure, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, Gary Snyder, they all read. And, so the heritage was, I mean, the hippies on stage and, in front of the stage understood that connection. And, they were back in their, most of the people, that 40,000 people in front of that stage, I would be willing to bet, although obviously I can't prove it, most of them had had Howl, had On the Road, had all kinds of beat literature back at home. And that was one of the things that, as I say, caused them to diverge from the common path.
Also divergent were the counterculture scenes in San Francisco and the Bay Area, and then you have on the East Coast, you have what was happening in New York. And, what is it about, clearly, we have people who are capable of becoming chemists everywhere. What is it about the Bay Area that made it fertile for psychedelics to take root and become a part of the essence of the fabric of the place, as opposed to another scene where it was just as happening with folks like Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention right around the same time,
But I
in a
might
place
add,
like New York?
Zappa had nothing to do with psychedelics.
Very true. He was
He was
staunchly anti-drugs
staunchly
except for
anti-drug
cigarettes.
of any kind. And
Except for
frankly,
cigarettes.
I always was troubled by Zappa simply because it appeared to me, and I don't see any arguments against it, that he was really elitist and had basically a contempt for his audience. He liked to make fun of his audience, which did not strike me as the best approach. But leaving that aside, the thing you have to understand about the Bay Area and San Francisco from the beginning, cities happen because of business and commerce. And, they linked. Denver is Denver because the railroad lines crossed there, and it was a logical place to build a city, and etc. And so when cities happen for reasons like that, they're dominated by bourgeois values, by, work hard, make money, contribute, and so forth. Fine. San Francisco wasn't like that. San Francisco started because a bunch of whack jobs that didn't fit in wherever they were, and that includes Chile, China, and the East Coast of the United States, decided to chase gold. They were gamblers. They weren't, good bourgeois strivers. And they came to San Francisco and on the possibility of striking it rich. And most of them didn't, of course. But the fact is, there was this tradition of tolerance for crazy that
Interesting.
was unique. The only other place that's even anywhere like it, largely because it's not white Protestant, it's white Catholic, is New Orleans, which was, or it's not white, as a matter of fact, but Black and Creole and Spanish and French, Roman Catholic, had a very different, sort of cultural point of view. So in San Francisco, you've got all these crazies. Just as an example, there was a guy who went crazy. He basically flipped out. He'd been very wealthy on the stock. There was a lot of boom and bust there, and he went broke and decided that he was now the emperor of San Francisco. His name was Norton, and he decreed that he was Emperor Norton. And now every city has crazy people walking around the streets. That's sort of the package. The difference was that in San Francisco, he started coining his own money, literally printed dollar bill, Emperor Norton dollar bills. What makes San Francisco different is the bartenders and the restaurant people in San Francisco accepted them. It was a tribute to the heritage of San Francisco that they would respect Norton. I'm not saying every one of them did it, but he ate because of the kindness of strangers, as it were. And there was always, sex was legal in San Francisco, literally, through until World War One, when there was a whole, good government, we have to clean up for the troops thing. Prostitution was legal, both straight and gay prostitution. And these sorts of things were not normal in America, as I'm sure you know. So San Francisco had this room tolerance for crazy. That's not to say that it was, we had Republican mayors and a corrupt city government and churches and all that good stuff too. But the fact is that there was room for crazy in a way that was just not like the rest of the country, which is why first the Beats found a welcome in North Beach, and then the hippies in the Haight, and then gay people in the Castro, and it one by one, all this stuff happened, and it wasn't 100%. I mean, when it was looking like 100,000 people were going to arrive in the Haight in the summer of '67, because every high school kid, every high school and young college kid that was bored, which is to say almost all of them, read about the Haight, heard White Rabbit, and went, "There's something." You'll pardon the line. There's something happening here, which actually is an L.A. song, but never mind. And many of them came, and unfortunately, at that point, you have really young people. The people in the Haight in '66 that built the counterculture of the Haight were not kids. They were all people well into their 20s. They were into the arts. A lot of them, of course, into music, but painted arts, whatever, and they had capital, by which I mean emotional and modest world experience resources, whereas the people who came in the summer of '67 were like kids that knew there was something fabulous. But didn't have a lot to bring to it. They didn't want to create something. They mostly wanted to be once they got there, they realized they needed to be taken care of, which is what people like the Diggers, and in particular this wonderful church that was in the neighborhood called All Saints did. And the fact that it wasn't it was a scuffle, but it wasn't a disaster that summer. That thanks to those people, but it did sort of completely overload the city, and in particular that neighborhood, the Haight-Ashbury, and it sort of didn't recover for years because it's literally an overloaded environment.
I love that you brought up the story about is it Emperor Norton? I love that you included that in this book. I did not know that bit of history, but what I did know is that there is one chapter of The Sandman where Neil Gaiman writes a story about this guy called King Norton, who's the king of America, and and he has Norton bucks. And when I started reading the book and I got to that part, I had this total sense of deja vu, like, oh my gosh, I think I've read this story before.
Yeah,
but no, it's
that's
really
definitely where it came from.
Absolutely wonderful to hear that was inspired by a living legend. Like that's incredible. makes the story all that much more special to me. I'm curious, how you think that, you talk about. So as you go through the era, you don't romanticize it at all. And, you talk about stories like Emperor Norton in the book and, things that are a little bit more fanciful there, but there are also things that were, a little bit more gritty. And, for all of the positive aspirations of the movement, let's pause there and talk about what were the ideals of the beat movement.
Well, I talked about that a little already. That that's it, it was essentially realizing that the America of the '50s had basically lost. To be a little bit overly concise, it had lost its soul. It had you have a depression, you have a giant war in which huge effort, collective effort, had brought success against fascism. Uh, you have an immediate Cold War, which left people feeling, what I thought we won, and we won the World War II, and then suddenly they're in another war. Um, Sort of, ignoring the fact that 18 million Soviet citizens died. A lot more, they paid quite a price. And you have finally extraordinary prosperity, and a prosperity that's connected with a quantum level of greater sophistication technologically, so that literally, think about all the things that happened in the 1950s. Uh, Refrigerators, okay? Before World War II, refrigerators were called ice boxes, and they required ice. Suddenly, you've got electrical appliances. You've got frozen food, which frankly wasn't so good for you, which is one of the things that the hippie scene reacted against. But never mind. You've got television, et cetera, et cetera. And all of this what seemed to be magical, magical new world that people were in. And the price for that, because of the Cold War, the price for that was conformity. I was talking with one of the beat poets, a guy named Michael McClure, and I said, basically kind of naively, why did On the Road and Howl, the best known beat statements, why do they have such an enormous impact to where all the people that you can think of in the 60s, the Dylan and Garcia and Janis Joplin and all those people, David Bowie, you name it, not all, but many encountered the beats and went, oh, there's a different way of living. And I said, why did it have such an impact? And he sort of looked at me and he said, Dennis, were you around in the 50s? I said, well, I was 10 when they ended, so not so much. And he went, well, and that's the point. The 50s were so stagnant, were so frozen, were so, they called it the silent generation. And until into the 60s, it was. So that when the Beats announce, well, the emperor has no clothes. This isn't a perfect society, because there was a lot of flag waving about, we're and it was true. It was there's the world in the 50s, and there's America, prosperous, totally militarily dominant, etc. And they're saying, well, that's not enough. You need some soul. You need a spiritual aspect to life, and much of what was going on in the 50s was a sort of rote Christianity that really didn't go as much to the heart as you'd want. And that's what On the Road's about, is that the world is a more spiritual place than Billy Graham, say. And people picked up on that. They didn't. They didn't always. The straight media didn't always recognize that, but the young people did, and that's the core of what happened. And as I say, you add on things like being against, militarism and phony flag waving and materialism and all that good stuff. And that's what, the beat planted a seed, which again, as time went along, and you add, actually you add two things. You add LSD and you add rock and roll. And the result is the hippie scene. Now you mentioned briefly, why the Bay Area was appropriate to LSD. There's a number of reasons for that. Obviously, the Greenwich Village has been the source of anti mainstream thinking since Walt Whitman, but the essential fact of what was happening in the 60s was the psychedelic, I think, or one of the critical elements was the psychedelic experience. Not to put down New York, but I would argue that one of the essential elements of experiencing psychedelics is to do it in nature, and to do it relating
Agreed.
to nature. And Tompkins Square Park is about as much nature as Greenwich Village and the Lower East Side has. Not so much, in other words. San Francisco, literally standing on Haight Street, you look down on Golden Gate Park, you can see Mount Tam in the distance. They're in close access. San Francisco is connected to nature in ways that most American cities aren't. And then secondly, it had a particularly industrious, insanely industrious gentleman by the name of Owsley Stanley, who made 5 million hits of LSD, the finest LSD maybe ever made. And, he fueled what happened in San Francisco by making all that LSD available. A lot of it ended up in New York, but obviously, it wasn't the same as having, your friendly neighborhood chemist just across the bay in Berkeley.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned being 10 at the end of the 50s, right around when this movement is picking up pace. When exactly was your intersection with Jerry Garcia and your introduction to this alternative way of thinking?
I've frequently said that the reason I've spent my adult life since 1972 working on books about the counterculture or divergent aspects was that I missed it all. I graduated high school in '67. Bruce Springsteen and I, and a lot of other people, and I remember consciously. I was going to high school in a little, very kind of xenophobic backwoods town in the backwoods of Maine. Long story about how I got there, but I was an outsider. And not that anybody loves their high school, hardly anybody loves their high school experience, but I was particularly unusual, and you don't want to be unusual in high school. And
I've been in 3, I know.
Yeah, me too. So anyway, I was hanging out in the library, and I actually have an actual memory of running across, I think it was Life magazine, pictures of Jerry Garcia wearing the Uncle Sam top hat at the B end. And I remember thinking, well, that's interesting. And then I got to college and I ran across their album, the first album, which was then like 6 months old, Graretul Dead, and was sort of interested. And I read On the Road in high school. So I was sort of aware of all this stuff. And then what happened was, when I was looking for a dissertation topic in graduate school, as I say, what happened was that I was, sort of almost muttering to myself, maybe the beats, the beats would be interesting. And my buddy said, you should do Kerouac. His papers are at Columbia, and you can stay with my friends in the Bronx. Now, when you're a broke graduate student, somebody tells you you have a place to stay in New York where you can do all your research. This is gold. This is a rainbow. Um, and it all worked out. And I might add that, just for example, the people that were in that apartment, they were all young. I was a first year graduate student. They were like juniors at Fordham, are still some of my closest friends. Thank God.
Oh, it's an incredible thing. Um, you mention, besides for Jerry Garcia, of course, and the people you mentioned earlier. I mean, there are just dozens of people, and I don't know if it was off camera or during the interview. We talked about the glossary of names. Was there any sort of litmus or filter for who made the list or who didn't, or was it as
Well,
inclusive as possible?
I wanted to write an encyclopedia,
Mm.
which is among other things why somebody said that, and I can take the hit that too often I had to be so succinct that it came across as a Wikipedia entry, which I'm sorry about, because I mean I would have loved to have written a book twice as long, but you can't. I mean the publishing industry doesn't permit that in this day and age. Um, I wanted to be uh, to touch on the many different streams, because it was music, it was theater, it was painting art, it was dance. I mean, so all these arts and the political scene coming from Berkeley, and the civil rights movement and rock and roll and the folk scene, all of them merge into what happened in the Haight. And so I tried to get all of that in and still, keep it to a reasonable minimum number of pages. Um, the litmus test for getting into the glossary was simple, and that is if I when you introduce a name, you put it in context. You have to. You can't just throw it in. If it only appears once, then fine. It doesn't need any further note. But if it appeared a second time, but like four
Mm.
pages, 5 pages, 10 pages later, um, where nobody would remember, then you need a glossary entry.
I found it particularly helpful, and it was
Good.
really genuinely refreshing to have such an appendix at the end of the book. And like I mentioned earlier, to be able to refer to and get that context. The context is everything, and it's how we understand life. And to be
That's my
able
specialty.
to, yeah, and to be able to read it, and it shows, to be able to read about this history and have, with the Grateful Dead, we have an area where we know the cast of characters very well. And I don't think enough could be said about them, but some may say they've been overly written about. But this is very much so not an era, as you mentioned earlier, that is overly written about. And you just went over several, and I didn't mean to interject, but there are just so many areas to explore, and there are so many threads that you do pick up on in this book. If you did have to pick one that you could explore further, what would it be?
Oh God. Well, ordinarily, I'd say the Art Institute, because it spawned a lot of wonderful people and wonderful ideas, both in the 40s when it was sort of first happening, and again in the late 50s when these people were not only creating great art but really influencing people like Jerry and others, the younger people. Um, there's also a scene, but I was going to say. I would write about the Art Institute, but actually, there's a great book that takes care of that. It's called Painterland, and I recommend it to people if they want to know more about the artist. There's some just great material there. I looted it. Remember, a plagiarist steals from one person, a scholar steals from everybody, and
Facts.
that was one of the ones I looted the most. The other is an institution called the Tape Music Center, which was these three um, electronic composers. Now, electronic music, generally speaking, did not, it's not socially popular, and it did not, it's not, with certain exceptions, does not, pop up in the popular culture a lot. But the one in San Francisco, they had this building, and they brought in the uh, Ann Halpern Dancers, which was this revolutionary dance group in the Bay Area. And they also had KPFA, which was the very important radio station in Berkeley. And they partnered also to have a San Francisco studio, as it were. And that the three of them generated an energy that was way more than the sum of their parts. And all kinds of different people came to the Tape Music Center and took from it whatever they could, and went off to other directions. Two great examples being a guy named George Hunter, who later founded the Charlatans, whose girlfriend was one of those Ann Halpern dancers, very important in avant-garde culture in the early 60s. And at the same time, another guy by the name of Phil Lesh, who wanted to be an avant-garde composer, and had been playing trumpet, and connected with some of the early, again, if you don't know this realm, these names don't mean anything, but there was a guy named Steve Reich and another guy named Terry Riley, who were very important avant-garde composers. And again, not for the pop culture, but really important for exploring different ways of hearing, shall we say. And that was good. That was great stuff. And again, I just had to cut everything to the bone because part of the deal is you got to keep the story moving and not lose people in too much detail.
That is true. And you do cover a lot, though. That being said, you do cover quite a bit, and
I tried.
one of the things that I appreciate is that the range of music that you approach when it comes to the history of this movement. So we have experimental composition coming from folks like John Cage. We have folk music. We have rock music. How did musical form in its way shape the forms of the other entities in the local zeitgeist, like the social political local formations?
Well, obviously, music carries with it its own context. You listen to jazz, then you're listening to the African American experience, and and that's exactly what I might add. The Grateful Dead did when they started as a rock band. You have this weird melange of a bluegrass banjo player, a former jazz trumpeter, um, a folkie, a blues musician, and an R&B drummer. And what ends up uniting them is John Coltrane and
Mm.
improvisational music. And they committed without I don't know, I'm not sure how much they even were aware of it at the time. To quote Bob Weir, uh, the song was over, but we weren't done playing. And they started improvising, and it just stretched and stretched, and it became their essential DNA. Um, uh, so that's one kind of music. Folk music, of course, has been associated with left wing politics and the civil rights movement at least since the IWW around the turn of the century. Um, and then rock and roll, which again is where black music meets white music. The seminal rock and roll song, for instance, I would argue, is Maybelline. Right, it's Chuck Berry's first hit.
Chuck Berry's Maybelline, yeah.
Chuck
Okay.
Berry's Maybelline. That is based on Bob
Nice.
Wills, a black, or actually he's white, but a big band swing song called Ida Red, which actually was country swing and had country elements with a black man playing basically hyped up lead blues guitar. Um, that's what rock and roll was. And then you had all the 50s rockers. Elvis goes into the army. Little Richard finds God or refines God. Chuck Berry goes to jail, etc. And what happens? A bunch of guys in Liverpool
Mhm.
who happen to
Of
be,
all places.
well, no, very logical place because all the sailors, it was the port of England, and all those sailors were going into the ports of New Orleans and Charleston, and they were buying black records. They didn't know and they didn't care who made them, but that's what they were bringing back to Liverpool. There was also a big American air base in Liverpool, just outside Liverpool. So there's this heavy American musical instrument influence in Liverpool. And one of them is what turns out to be a genius of music, two of them in particular. And they create the Beatles, which is the single greatest baby boomer cultural artifact. I mean, single
Agreed.
event. And Shazam. And then, as I say, add LSD and look out.
There she blows.
There you
Absolutely.
go.
That's a potent Yeah, you're absolutely right. The Beatles and LSD are a potent combination to all of a sudden land on the shores of America. That is it's really interesting though to hear that recycling of it. And the way that it comes back around, that's I think these are the pockets of history that go unexplored that you dive into in this book that are really worth the time and are really worth people taking the extra moment to really learn about what it is. And it does that for me, for me at least.
I'm
Do you
glad.
feel
That's
like
that's
it
what
did
I
that for you?
that's what I was after. I I'm a I have some skill as a storyteller, and I could see that the story fascinated me, um, and it resonates with other people.
You mentioned many artists, and there are many more mentioned in the book. I'm curious to know who your favorite overlooked artist from this era is.
There's a woman named Jay DeFeo, and I urge you and anybody who's listening to Google Jay. Her last name's spelled capital D, capital F-E-O. I think it's a capital F. Anyway, but anyway, that you'll get it. And her masterpiece is a painting called The Rose, and I talk about it in the book. It's at the Whitney. If you're a New Yorker, you can go down to the end of the Hudson Walkway, and she it's beyond amazing, and I think as David Getz, who was the drummer for Big Brother, said, before people even realized what psychedelic was, it's psychedelic. And it's an important painting. There's a famous book by a guy named Hoving, who was the czar of culture in New York City in the '60s. Who I think he did the most 100 important artists or something, and the only woman in the most modern of them is Jay DeFeo. So he recognized how really important she is, and yet not so many people know about her, which is a great pity.
Speaking of a great pity, the book is entitled The Last Great Dream, which is kind of a bummer for my generation because it does imply that Well, my question to you would be this: is the last great dream ongoing from what you see from your perspective, or was it the last great dream that's been dreamt?
I came up with that title. It just, it fell into my head, and it wasn't like I rationally thought of it. Certainly, it was a great dream, and somehow it came along with last. Do I think it's never going to happen again? Well, it's hard. It's hard to see that right in 2026 when we have a completely insane political system. Um, so the answer is I don't know. Uh, as I reflected on it, you could also just say it was the most recent great dream, and there will be. One hopes there will be more. Um, uh, it, the problem. I mean, the thing you have to understand is that what happened in the '60s um, is moved into our. It did not affect our politics as enough, um, but it affected our culture. I mean, if you do yoga, if you eat organic food, if you care about the environment, if you care about LGBTQ issues, you're being directly affected by the '60s, and that hasn't gone away at all.
So if that was indeed the last great dream for our readers, listeners, and viewers out there, what would you say is the ultimate thesis statement of this book?
That in the '60s there was a packet, a collective bunch of ideas. Um, they weren't new. Thoreau thought of almost all of them. Uh, it's one of the reasons I love them. But they flowered in a really important way, and they're not to be forgotten.
Absolutely, and like I mentioned earlier, Thoreau in particular, and Walden is something. At least part of it is something that I tried to include in my lessons every single year that I taught English, because for me, just the ability to take something in and sit in. It's something that as an interviewer, it's something that I'm continually working on, to not jump up and interrupt and pause and really like sit back and wait for the person to finish. It's a continual growing process that I feel like we are forever students. We never stop learning. And I'm curious to hear if you think that unfortunately technology may have stunted that.
Um, there seems no question that the ubiquity of screens, and I don't claim to be impervious to it. I spend way too much time looking at my phone, but yeah, um, one of the things that made the Scene and the Hate special was that it was beneath the radar, and until the be-in, nobody paid any attention. Uh, and unfortunately, people say, can we have that again? And I say, well, however we have it, it can't be nothing's underneath the radar. 4 minutes after somebody has an idea, it's all over social media, and and for good or bad. Sometimes it's good, but so however things evolve, they'll have to evolve in a different way because of the internet and the one worldness of communications now.
I remember my students flipping out, showing them that can just shade the note underneath the previous note to see what was written, and them not understanding what a pencil was and how that worked, and just being like, "I need to leave teaching. This is the sign. The kids don't know what pencils." I tried to make my students write out all of their assignments because to me, you have to be tactile with it. You have to be involved with it. You have to be with. There you go. You got one right there.
That Thoreau's business, his family business, was making pencils. They had access to lead, graphite. Probably it's what killed him too, um, and lead poisoning. But anyway, they made pencils, and I have a authentic Thoreau and Son pencil from Walden.
Oh wow, that that is really that's
Well, I mean, it
really cool.
wasn't from his time. They're still making, they still make them at the shop at Walden Pond, but it's it touches it touches the
Yeah,
past.
I got a little goosebumps just reading the name from over here. Like, I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah, yeah.
you
Well,
see that
next
on
time
a,
next time you get up to Massachusetts, you can get one.
I
And
hope
if
to
you
get
haven't
back.
been to Walden Pond, I recommend it. It's you will get goosebumps. It's a special place. And even though it's the town swimming hole in Concord, it's a very wonderful place.
The credit that you give to Walden, I'm curious. For the benefit of the average reader, listener, or viewer who's not as familiar with his work, what would you say are some of the theses of him that you would like to share?
Well, keep in mind that Thoreau is in the 1850s, where there was no other particular person. Emerson was this high intellectual. Thoreau was a little closer to the ground and was challenging almost every tenet of American thought, of what the American identity was. He rejected the idea that America was uniquely perfect. He rejected the idea that nature was there to be exploited. And instead that in fact that we were part of nature, not, in charge of nature. He rejected the Protestant work ethic that life was, that you were supposed to work and make money, and that was everything. He rejected uh, by being basically celibate as the conventional sexual attitudes of the era. He rejected Christianity as being the only religious practice that you could possibly have. He rejected everything. He challenged everything, and he was alone. I mean, it's easy for me to say some of this stuff now because I have all kinds of context to say it in, but he was out on the edge. And that's why he's my favorite American, for example.
Yeah, I do agree with you. I think, as you put it, the ubiquity of screens is really it's really because
It's a different world.
it really truly is, and I am of that generation where I remember what it was like before we had that,
Me
and
too.
I am probably on the younger end of the generations that remember.
Yep.
Um, and that's you know, it's a real disappointing thing. And I'm curious, how did it feel, when you were, beginning to ingratiate yourself in the scene and, and living in it, living out these ideals? How did it feel writing about them later on, reflecting on some of these ideals that were fundamental and, core to the band that you worked so closely with?
Mostly I just felt lucky. I I uh I saw these connections. It's not like um I sat around with Bill Kreutzmann discussing Thoreau. He lived it. He didn't, intellectualize it. Um, Occasionally just had discussions like that with Jerry, but on the whole, it was a matter of living it, not, and I'm going to wind up with my favorite line about the Grateful Dead. Um, Ramrod was the Grateful Dead's crew chief and really as important in the Grateful Dead scene. People don't, wouldn't necessarily know him, but as important as any band member. He really was at the core of who the Grateful Dead were. And one day we were at RFK Stadium, which meant it was midsummer. It was 100 degrees and 100% humidity. It was disgusting. And we'd been there for about 10 hours setting up, the stage. He was setting up the stage. I was running around doing my own setup. And we were leaving to go back to the hotel, and got to the top of I was just happened to be behind him. And we got to the top of the stairs, and he sort of sighed and said, "Well, at least it's not a real job."
A phenomenal way to part. And before we close, we didn't ask our first question, so I'll ask it last. And a rare twist for Secondhand Talent. Dennis, we discussed it previously, but when you first heard the name Secondhand Talent, what were your thoughts?
Well, I heard it from Susanna Millman, my wife, who was interviewed and who told me about it and told me, the premise. And as I said, my reaction was that I thought it was a great premise. That is to say, to talk to the people who aren't up on the stage, whether it's music or other cultural stuff, the stagehands, the people who support, who are really important. I mean, certainly the Grateful Dead. They had the same crew for forever, and they treated. They gave respect to the crew in ways that most bands probably don't so much. But that, to me, just as a writer and as in language, to me, secondhand sort of implies, it leads into second rate or second level, is sort of less important, and that I don't know what I would replace it with, but it just I wondered at the choice of the name. As I say, I love the premise, and I as someone who has zero talent for music, I got to be in a scene in which they recognized that the people in the crew, and in fact the audience and everybody else in the room, was part of the band. Again, I'm not sure all bands think that, but certainly the Grateful Dead did. So I got to join the band, even though I couldn't tell a note from, one note from the other. But yeah, so I have reservations, but
Well,
obviously
as
the questions were good.
Well, as a comedian, I resembled that remark,
There
so
you go.
I just want to put that out there. But I just, oh, what a great, it's just been a great conversation. It's been a great time having you on the show, and
I enjoyed it too.
I can't thank you enough for sharing your time with me, ladies and
My
gentlemen.
pleasure.
The one, the only, Dennis McNally. This is Steiner with another episode of Secondhand Talent, and we will see you next Wednesday. And that's a podcast. All right.
Thank
There we
you.
go.
Okay.
Thank